Story 1. Hunter becomes the hunted. I've always considered myself a pragmatic person, especially when it comes to the outdoors. Hunting has been a part of my life since I was a kid. I've hunted deer and even bagged a few turkeys for Thanksgiving, but boars are a different challenge, one that I love. Boars are a menace in many parts of the United States due to their rapid breeding and destructive nature. Those pigs will eat anything and everything. As such, the Department of Fish and Wildlife usually makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, you can even hunt them at night. After a year of saving, mostly skimming off my discretionary funds, which wasn't easy to justify to my wife, I finally purchased a night vision scope. Twice the cost of my rifle, this thermal scope was my pride and joy. I had this perfect spot in mind. It was a place riddled with boar activity. It was perfect though because it was accessible by truck and had an ideal vantage point overlooking a clearing. I was excited to use the scope for the first time, so one night I geared up and headed out. The first few hours of my night hunt were uneventful. I saw some deer and other critters, but that game wasn't what I had come for. Around 2 a.m., I started to think about packing it up, marking this night off as a loss. As I started gathering everything up and heading back towards my truck, however, I began hearing a crunching sound coming from a distance. Checking through my scope, I could see the outline of what I believed to be a small bear pushing through the bushes. As I adjusted the range of my scope and zoomed in a little bit though, a jolt of shock shot through me when I discovered that it wasn't a bear at all. It was a man. He was completely naked, and he was on all fours, moving slowly and twitching erratically. I watched, completely disturbed, as he sniffed around and began scraping the ground with his palms. The way he moved was animalistic, unnerving. I felt like I was losing my mind, but at the same time, I was seeing everything as clear as day. The way he was sniffing around turned my blood completely cold. I had been in that spot earlier, and it's like he was trying to catch my scent, like he knew I was there. His actions were more animal than human, and it completely terrified me. As I watched in disbelief, trying to figure out what in the hell was going on, he did something that I'll never be able to erase from my mind. He looked straight up and emitted a high-pitched feminine plea for help. "Help! I'm lost!" It was surreal. The sounds coming from this guy didn't match what I was seeing through my scope. "Help! Please! I can't walk!" Every fiber in me was screaming at me, telling me that something was wrong and that this was a trap. This guy, or thing, or whatever the hell it was trying to lure me in. For a brief second, I set the rifle down and began to hastily pack up, as quietly as I could. It was time to go, and I was still a little distance from my truck. I did my best to keep quiet, but when I looked back through my scope, he was staring directly at me. For a moment, the both of us just stared at each other. He was locked onto me, and I was locked onto him through the tiny lens of the night vision scope. The sound of my short, ragged breaths, trying to keep myself under control, was all that could be heard. Finally, he stood up, slowly and deliberately. I could see that he was easily 6 foot tall, skinny as hell, and he looked to be completely hairless. With his eyes still locked on me, he took a couple of strides in my direction. I decided that I'd had enough. "Get back!" I yelled at the guy. Then I sent a warning shot sailing above his head into the tree line. "Take another step and I'll end you," I screamed out. His reaction was inhuman. He dropped down to all fours and continued to stare at me. I continued to yell threats, but my voice was now trembling in terror. Then, out of nowhere, he bolted with astonishing speed, vanishing into the brush. I fired another shot, more to vent my fear than anything else. Hurrying back to my truck, I could hear piercing screams coming from the distance. I threw everything into my truck and sped off, dust and dirt flying off the back of my tires. The next day, I reported the incident, but it was met with complete indifference. "Yeah, that sounds weird," they said. "Definitely let us know if you see anything else." And that was it. No follow-up, no nothing. It was the scariest thing I'd ever encountered in the woods. It left me with so many questions that I'll probably never get answers to. Was it a deranged individual? Someone on drugs? How in the hell was he able to make himself sound like a woman in distress? I'll never know, I guess. And unfortunately, I'll never go back to that part of the woods at night ever again. Story 2. A Man Out of Place. A few years back, my dad and I were out on an old trail, walking deep into the woods. We were deer hunting, but truth be told, it was each other's company and the serenity of nature that we truly sought. The relationship between my dad and me was one of those rare bonds that seemed to transcend the usual father-son dynamics. It was built on the foundation of mutual respect, a shared love for the quietude of the great outdoors, and an unspoken understanding that often communicated more than words ever could. Throughout the years, my dad and I embarked on countless hunting trips together, each one etching a memory more cherished than the last. Our ventures into the woods had always been graced with cheerful moods and memorable moments. They were an unmarred series of delightful adventures. Unbeknownst to us at the time, that year was destined to be the one to break our perfect run. We'd been hiking for quite a while with our gear in tow. About an hour in, we settled on a spot and broke off to cover more ground. I found an old log a little off the path and took a seat, while my dad walked down further, finding a nice spot to sit, still within sight of me. For a while, all was quiet. The forest around us was serene, a peaceful haven, where the only sounds were the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. That peace, however, was interrupted by the hurried crunch of footsteps on the leaf-strewn ground. In the distance, I could see a figure approaching. It was a man, dressed not in the camouflage of hunters, but in plain, unassuming clothes. To his side, he nonchalantly carried a Glock handgun, the sight of which set off silent alarms in my head. He wasn't strolling. He was marching with purpose, and he was heading straight towards my dad. As he neared my father, he raised his head, and I could hear him ask if my father had seen anything. The question was typical for hunters checking on others' luck, but this guy's demeanor was completely off. I couldn't shake the feeling that this man was up to something that he didn't want anyone to see, and my dad and I had walked up on him. The woods were dead quiet now, and you could cut the tension with a knife. Something was amiss, and I could feel it deep down inside. As I watched the man and my father talk, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, far off in the distance. Believing that the man talking to my dad had not yet noticed me, I slowly brought up the binoculars I had around my neck. It was another guy, a good distance off. This one was dressed down like the first, no hunter's orange in sight, and I could see the unmistakable shape of a Glock tucked into his pants. My stomach knotted up, and a rush of adrenaline hit me hard. Turning my attention back to my dad and the first man, I chambered around, preparing for a confrontation. Suddenly, I could see my dad, gesturing towards where I sat. As they both turned toward me, I acknowledged them with a nod and a half-hearted wave, not willing to let go of my rifle. The stranger's eyes looked over at me, and it was then that something in his gaze shifted. I could see him turn back to my dad, and then, without another word, he turned the other way, back towards the direction of the other man for a moment, before turning back towards my dad. He was contemplating his next move. I could see it, and I could feel it. Whatever his initial thoughts and plans were, it seemed as if my presence threw a wrench into it. Finally, after a few more heart-pounding moments, he said a few more words to my dad, and then began to walk away. He retreated with the same hurried pace as he had arrived with. Dad and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement that something was amiss, and we didn't need to stick around any longer. As the man reconnected with the second individual in the distance, I made my way over to my dad. "We should go," he said, and with that, we began walking back out the way we came in. When we finally reached the safety of our vehicle, my dad began to detail the encounter with the stranger. "Everything felt off," he said. "The guy tried to talk up conversation about hunting, but the whole thing felt like a front," he said. "Everything changed, though, when I mentioned you were there." As he told me this, my eyes grew wide and deep down inside. I felt like my presence probably saved my dad's life. "Did you see the second guy?" I asked. To that my dad responded, "I didn't know there was a second guy." Weeks passed, and the encounter became a story we recounted to our friends and family. It wasn't until a month later that my dad called me up, his voice somber over the line. "Son, you remember that day in the woods?" he asked. "Well," he continued, "I was at the gas station and the deputy pulled up. I told him about it, and he told me there have been several drug busts in that area. Apparently that part of the woods has been used for drops." My hair stood on end. Just as I had suspected, the man with the Glock and his partner weren't hunters. They were out there in the woods for different reasons. The realization that we could have been witnesses to something we were never meant to see, that our lives might have hung in the balance on the edge of that stranger's whim, was chilling. Though we never went back to that part of the woods, we refused to let it deter us from what we loved, the beauty of nature and the time spent in each other's company. Story 3. Woman in the Woods. My favorite spot in the world is a secluded little piece of heaven I like to call my honey hole. It's nestled about 3 miles deep into the national forest. It's where I escape the world, immerse myself in nature, and when the season is right, I hunt. It was last November when I decided to make the trek in for a weekend of hunting. As usual, I set up my hammock, stringing it between 2 sturdy oaks that I swear have stood there since the dawn of time. I readied my gear for the early morning hunt. My rifle was clean and my mind was clear. That night, the forest was alive with all the nocturnal sounds, the hoots of owls, the rustle of foliage as creatures skittered through, and the distant howl of a lone wolf. I had been in these woods many times and had come to know them like the lines on my own hands. There was a comforting certainty in the knowledge that I had experienced all this place had to offer. Yet that night, things would be different. As I lay in my hammock, swaying just a bit with the breeze, a scream cut through the dark night. It was so piercing and so full of terror, it could have raised the dead. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard in the woods before, and it was terrifying. There was an urgency to it that got my heart hammering and my instincts on full alert. I've heard the cries of bobcats and foxes, mountain lions, and everything in between, but this was no animal. It was blood-curdling and unmistakably human. Instinct took over and I flew out of my hammock. I scampered over to my backpack and fumbled for my night vision binoculars. As I scanned the murky edges of the swamp, my heart continued to thunder in my chest. I scanned back and forth, searching, looking for anything. Suddenly another scream rang out. To my left, I panned over. In the little 3-inch screen, I saw a figure, the shape of a woman, sprinting desperately about 200 yards out. What in the hell? Why was she out here? And what was she running from? The nearest dirt road was a good mile in the opposite direction from where she was heading. Nothing made sense. I dropped the binoculars and picked up my rifle. Although it was dark, I hoped that there'd be just enough moonlight to see what was giving chase. If she was in trouble, perhaps maybe I could fire off a few shots to defend her. I used the scope to search for any signs of a pursuer. A bear, maybe? But there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just the eerie silence that followed behind her. By the time I dropped the rifle and picked the binoculars back up, she was gone, and it was completely quiet, like she was never there. On edge and confused, I didn't know what to do. I sat there for a minute, trying to process the events before deciding that I should try to get some sleep. It seemed that she was gone, and it didn't seem like there was anything that I could do. Drifting off was a battle. Every little sound and gust of wind had me twitching. Eventually, though, exhaustion won out, and I dozed off. It would be short-lived, however. I couldn't tell you how long I was asleep for, but sometime in the middle of the night, my eyes shot open when I began to hear what I believed to be footsteps pacing around just outside my camp. Raising my head up slightly, I looked around and listened. But it was quiet again, as if nothing had passed through at all. Convincing myself that it was just my imagination, I leaned my head back and eventually fell asleep once more. With the first light of dawn, I ventured out to where I had last seen the figure, the woman. The previous night was a blur, and I needed proof that I wasn't just hearing and seeing things. As I neared the area, any doubts I had about whether or not I had been imagining things were put to rest. There, in the soft mud, were footprints, small, bare, and undoubtedly human. My blood ran cold. I was so confused and began losing the motivation to hunt that day. Nothing in the last few hours felt right, and I decided that it was time to go. As I made my way back into camp and began to pack, another thought shot through me. The footsteps last night, while I was in the hammock. As I examined the periphery of my campsite, again, I found footprints. This time they were very large and very deep. There were boot prints. I assumed that they were from a very large man. Someone was watching me as I slept last night. Without much else thought, I finished packing and headed out. The series of events alarmed me enough to report it. I told the authorities about the woman and about the footprints, both sets. Unsurprisingly, though, I never heard anything back. There are so many questions about that night that I'll never get answers to. Who was that woman? Who was the man walking around my camp? Was he the one pursuing her? Although the night was one I'll never forget, I've never let it keep me from my passion of hunting. I still go out in the woods and I still camp, but I'm more mindful now of the things that go on out there, especially at night.